In the middle of a marble hotel lobby, two police officers stopped Celine Voss, tore the bag from her hands, and announced they had received a tip that she was carrying illegal drugs. Wealthy guests stepped back. Several raised their phones to record, and the lieutenant coldly dumped every item from her belongings onto a marble table. There were no drugs, there was no weapon, there was only a black leather case sealed with a golden clasp. When he forced it open, the golden seal of the United States Federal Court caught the light, and the entire lobby went silent. If you want to witness power reverse itself in the final second, hit subscribe and stay with this tense, unforgettable story to the end. Celine Voss arrived at the Halcyon Crown Hotel before the most important federal hearing in the history of Havenport, Missouri. She had been quietly assigned to oversee a civil rights lawsuit accusing the city police department of conducting hundreds of searches built on racial profiling rather than probable cause. To avoid drawing attention from local media, she wore no robe, rode in no official vehicle, and asked her federal escort, Deputy United States Marshal Callum Drake, to keep his distance. She carried only a brown leather bag and a black document case stamped with the golden seal of the United States District Court for the Western District of Missouri. And she moved through the world the way she always had, without announcement. On the ballroom floor above, a fundraising gala for the Havenport Police Foundation was already underway, and the room was full of the city's most influential faces. Maxwell Ashford, the most powerful real estate developer in Havenport, stood near the bar in a tailored charcoal suit, while Police Chief Brennan Crow worked the room with practiced warmth. Celine felt the weight of curious glances the moment she stepped through the revolving doors, and the front desk clerk asked her for a second form of identification. Something the white businessman ahead of her in line had never been asked to provide. She did not raise her voice or demand an apology. She simply noted the clerk's name tag, the time on the lobby clock, and the exact position of the nearest security camera, filing the details away the way she filed away everything that mattered. Celine had built an entire career on that habit of quiet observation, the discipline of a woman who had spent 2 decades inside courtrooms, learning that the loudest voice in a room rarely told the most reliable story. She had grown up in a modest brick house on the edge of a struggling neighborhood, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night, and a father who drove a delivery truck through every kind of weather. And she had learned early that dignity was something people had to defend for themselves, because no one handed it to them freely. Law school had been a lonely climb, full of rooms where she was often the only black woman present, and she had trained herself never to let frustration show on her face, because she understood how quickly composure could be mistaken for arrogance, and how quickly anger could be mistaken for guilt. By the time she was confirmed to the federal bench, she had already perfected the art of being underestimated, and she had come to see it less as an insult than as a strange kind of advantage. She crossed the lobby toward the elevator bank with her bag over one shoulder and the black case tucked beneath her arm, moving past clusters of gala guests who barely registered her presence at all. A waiter offered her a glass of champagne from a passing tray, assuming she belonged to the catering staff rather than the guest list. And Celine declined with a polite shake of her head, unbothered by an error she had encountered more times than she could count. She thought briefly of the hearing scheduled for the following morning, of the stacks of testimony describing officers who stopped cars for cracked taillights and ended up searching purses and trunks for reasons that never appeared anywhere in writing. The case had already consumed months of her attention, and she intended to walk into that courtroom having read every page of it twice. Before she reached the elevator, her phone buzzed with a message from Mira Langley, a city auditor secretly cooperating with the Department of Justice, warning her that someone already knew about that night's meeting and that she should not trust any officer inside the hotel. Celine read the message twice, slipped the phone into her coat pocket, and lifted her eyes just as two uniformed officers pushed through the glass doors and walked directly toward her. The taller one, Lieutenant Vance Harland, named the exact color of her bag before he had ever seen it from the front, a detail so small that almost no one else in the lobby would have noticed it at all. Celine noticed it immediately, and something in her chest went very still and very calm, the way it always did right before trouble arrived. Harlan announced that the department had received a tip describing a black woman in a gray coat carrying narcotics into the hotel, a description so vague it could have matched dozens of women in the building that evening. Yet, he insisted, Celine matched it perfectly. She asked him in an even, unhurried voice where the tip had originated, what specific identifying details it contained, and whether she was currently being detained. Harlan treated her precise legal questions as defiance rather than reasonable inquiry, and when she asked whether he had a warrant or any articulable suspicion beyond a coat color, he reached out and tore the bag from her hands without waiting for an answer. Gala guests began drifting toward the commotion, forming a loose circle around the scene. and several onlookers studied Celine's face as though she had already been proven guilty of something. Maxwell Ashford stood on the second floor balcony above the lobby, arms folded, watching in silence. Harlan raised his voice just enough for the gathering crowd to hear him say that people who sold drugs often dressed well and spoke like lawyers to throw officers off balance. A remark aimed less at Celine than at the audience forming around her. Elise Marin, the younger officer standing beside him, made no move to help with the search, and something in her expression suggested she had already noticed that Harlan never radioed dispatch to confirm the tip before acting on it. The marble floor beneath them seemed to swallow sound so that every word Harlan spoke carried further than he intended, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling and reaching the ears of guests who had drifted down from the ballroom to see what the commotion was about. Celine kept her hands visible and her voice level, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be fishing for, and that refusal appeared to irritate him more than any argument could have. A photographer near the concierge desk lifted a camera and began shooting frames of the scene, and Harlan glanced toward the lens with the faint practiced posture of a man who understood he was being watched and had decided the story would still favor him regardless of what the pictures showed. Somewhere behind the crowd, a valet whispered to a colleague that he had seen this kind of stop before. Always the same coat color, always the same neighborhood description, never once turning out to be true. Celine felt the particular exhaustion of having lived this exact moment in smaller forms many times across her life. The sidewalk stops, the store security who followed her down aisles, the questions about whether she truly belonged in the room she had earned a place inside. She did not let that exhaustion show on her face because she had learned long ago that visible frustration would only be used as evidence against her. Instead, she watched Harlan's hands, counted the seconds between his questions, and noted that he never once looked directly at his own radio, the tool any properly trained officer would have reached for the moment. A call came through describing a specific suspect. Celine turned her eyes toward the small camera clipped to Elise's chest and stated her full name, the time, and the fact that she did not consent to any search. A calm and deliberate act that visibly rattled Harlan more than any protest could have. He emptied her wallet, her keys, her phone, and her identification onto the marble table, and none of it resembled contraband in any way. Rather than stopping, his attention shifted to the black leather case resting at the bottom of the bag, and Celine warned him plainly that the case contained materials under federal jurisdiction and was not to be opened under any circumstances. Harlan smiled the thin, superior smile of a man who believed elaborate language was simply what guilty people used to disguise the truth. And from the balcony above, Maxwell Ashford gave Chief Crow a small, deliberate nod, a silent signal to let the case be opened. Harlan snapped the clasp and forced the case open in front of dozens of witnesses, and the first thing to emerge was not narcotics, but a document stamped with the golden seal of the United States Federal Court resting atop a Navy folder. Beneath it lay a judicial identification card bearing the words, Honorable Celine Voss, United States District Judge, printed in unmistakable federal lettering. Harlan went pale, but did not yet grasp the full weight of what he was holding, and he flipped further into the papers to find an order naming Celine as the presiding judge in the very civil rights case being brought against the Havenport Police Department. Beneath that sat an emergency directive instructing the immediate preservation of all body camera footage, dispatch logs, hotel surveillance, and internal communications connected to the department's pattern of questionable searches, and the lobby fell into complete silence around them. Celine did not snatch the case back from his hands. Instead, she asked Harlan, in a voice loud enough for every nearby camera to catch, to read the case number on the preservation order aloud for the record. Harlan began stammering an apology, calling the entire incident a misunderstanding, and Celine asked him, without a trace of anger, why the word misunderstanding had only occurred to him after he learned her title. Callum Drake arrived within seconds, flanked by 2 federal security officers, confirmed Celine's identity to the stunned crowd, and ordered that no one leave the area until every camera system nearby had its footage secured. Maxwell Ashford slipped away from the balcony the instant the order was given, and Chief Crow entered the lobby mere seconds later. A timing that made it obvious he had been standing close enough to watch the entire confrontation unfold. Celine accepted the case back from Harlan's shaking hands, noting a fresh scratch along the edge of the golden seal where he had pried the clasp open with his own key. She felt no urge to raise her voice or claim victory. She simply looked at him and said that from this moment forward, he was no longer explaining a search. He was preserving the scene of one, and the words landed in the silent lobby like a verdict already delivered. The woman treated like a criminal only minutes earlier was, in fact, the federal judge assigned to investigate the very police department that had just humiliated her. Chief Crow moved quickly into a softer strategy, apologizing profusely to Celine, offering to escort her to a private suite, and promising a full internal investigation into Harlan's conduct. Celine declined to leave the lobby until hotel surveillance, body camera footage, and dispatch logs were copied under direct federal supervision, refusing to let the matter dissolve into a quiet internal review. Behind the scenes, Crow quietly instructed several officers to power down their body cameras. And though Elise Marin hesitated, she left hers running, a small decision that Callum happened to witness from across the room. Hotel manager Marisol Vega announced that the lobby camera system had suffered a sudden technical failure. Yet Celine distinctly remembered the recording light glowing steadily throughout the entire confrontation. Harlan insisted the anonymous tip had come in at a precise moment that evening, a detail he repeated with rehearsed confidence. Elise glanced at her own body camera timestamp and realized the two officers had approached Celine several minutes before the tip he described had supposedly been logged. Tessa Harlow, an attorney from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, arrived at the hotel with an investigative team and immediately requested that the dispatch server be sealed for the night before any records could be altered. Crow objected, arguing that a minor misunderstanding did not warrant a federal intervention, and Tessa replied that the issue was no longer Celine's bag at all. But the unsettling fact that officers seemed to know exactly which bag to search before any legitimate tip had ever been received. A preliminary review by a forensic technician revealed that the anonymous call record had been manually entered from an account with administrator privileges rather than received through the normal emergency line. That account, without question, belonged to Chief Crow's own office. This was no random search gone wrong. Someone with real authority inside the department had sent Harlan to find something specific hidden inside Celine's bag, and the tip about narcotics had simply been the convenient excuse used to justify tearing it open in public. The story reached back sometime earlier when the Department of Justice first noticed a troubling pattern emerging across Havenport. Officers under Harlan's unit were repeatedly stopping vehicles, searching bags, and inspecting business licenses belonging to black residents based on vague, unverifiable anonymous tips that rarely led anywhere. Following these encounters, a striking number of shop owners lost their licenses or were pressured into selling their properties far below market value, and a significant share of those properties later ended up in the hands of Ashford Urban Holdings. Maxwell Ashford publicly branded the pattern a city redevelopment initiative, funding patrol vehicles, surveillance equipment, and unit overtime through generous donations to the Havenport Police Foundation. Celine had been selected for this assignment precisely because she was known for remaining unmoved by media pressure or local political entanglements, and her arrival in Havenport had been kept confidential until the morning of the hearing itself. Mira Langley, the city auditor reviewing the police department's budget, had uncovered an unusual payment code labeled Clean Corridor through which Ashford's donations were quietly funneled into targeted patrol operations in exactly the neighborhoods he wanted to acquire. Mira had planned to meet Tessa at the hotel that night to hand over a copy of the financial records, but someone had overheard enough of the plan to believe the documents would be hidden inside the bag of a black woman arriving that evening. When Celine showed up at the very same location carrying a case that looked strikingly similar, Harlan mistook her for the person carrying the evidence. And his own instinct to profile based on appearance had led him to choose the most dangerous possible target he could have picked. Crow's attorneys quickly spotted an opportunity in the chaos, arguing that because Celine herself had become a victim of the incident, she now faced an unavoidable conflict of interest and should step down from presiding over the very case she had been sent to oversee. Celine agreed without hesitation and transferred the ongoing investigation to Judge Elias Thorne, a move that visibly relieved everyone on Crow's legal team. They believed, quite mistakenly, that they had just removed their biggest obstacle from the courtroom entirely. Celine had no intention of stepping away from the fight, and she made it clear to Tessa that she would not be sitting behind the bench at the next hearing at all. She would be sitting in the witness chair instead, ready to describe exactly what had happened to her in that lobby. By morning, local news outlets across Havenport were running stories claiming Celine had deliberately concealed her identity and provoked the officers in order to manufacture evidence against the department. Maxwell Ashford appeared on a local broadcast urging viewers not to condemn an entire police force over what he called one unfortunate mistake. His attorney, Corbin Hale, accused Celine of using her judicial position to intimidate officers who were simply performing their assigned duties in good faith. A heavily edited clip began circulating that began only at the moment Celine warned Harlan not to open the case, conveniently cutting out the earlier footage of him tearing the bag from her hands and insulting her in front of the crowd. Crow suspended Harlan publicly to create the appearance of accountability, while privately instructing him to maintain the same story about the anonymous tip no matter what questions arose. Elise Marin was quietly reassigned out of the unit and warned that her career would end abruptly if she handed her body camera footage over to federal investigators. Celine was advised by court officials to remain silent publicly to protect the reputation of the judiciary, and she agreed not to speak to reporters. A decision Ashford mistakenly interpreted as her retreating from the fight altogether. Meanwhile, Callum discovered that the hotel's camera system had never actually malfunctioned at all, since Marisol Vega had merely disabled lobby access while the footage continued backing up automatically to an outside insurance server. Local radio hosts spent the better part of a week debating whether Celine had acted appropriately, with several callers insisting that any reasonable person would have simply announced her position the moment officers approached rather than allowing the confrontation to escalate in front of a crowd. A columnist for the city paper wrote an entire piece questioning why a federal judge would travel without a visible security detail at all, framing her caution as recklessness rather than a deliberate choice to avoid drawing attention to a sensitive case. Celine read none of it herself, though Callum kept a folder of the coverage in case any of it later became relevant to the pattern of public pressure being applied against her. Maxwell's Foundation quietly paid for a wave of sponsored segments praising the department's community outreach programs, timed precisely to compete with the negative attention the incident had generated. Inside the department, morale fractured along lines that had existed for years but rarely surfaced so openly. Younger officers who had joined hoping to rebuild trust with the community found themselves defending colleagues they privately believed had done something indefensible, while veterans loyal to Crow dismissed the entire controversy as an overreaction manufactured by outsiders who did not understand the pressures of the job. Elise found herself isolated in the break room, greeted with silence by people she had worked alongside for years, and she began keeping a small notebook of dates and conversations in case anyone later questioned her own account of events. The recovered footage showed Maxwell watching Harlan closely before the confrontation began, pointing toward Celine's location and gesturing subtly toward her bag. Because the recording carried no audio, it was suggestive but not yet proof enough to establish that he had personally ordered the search. That night, Elise reached out quietly to Tessa, agreeing to hand over a complete copy of her body camera footage on the sole condition that her younger sister and family would remain free from retaliation. When Tessa finally reviewed the recording in full, she heard something that changed the entire shape of the case, a single sentence Harlan had muttered to another officer just before entering the hotel that evening. He had said, quite plainly, that the chief wanted the black case retrieved before it ever reached the judge, and the officers had not been hunting for drugs at all. They had been sent to steal federal evidence before it could ever be examined in court. The formal hearing opened under the direction of Judge Elias Thorne, a strict and unflinching jurist who allowed neither Celine nor the department to rely on status to influence the proceedings. This time, Celine did not sit above the courtroom on the bench. She sat at the witness table instead, dressed in the same gray suit she had worn the night of the search. Corbin Hale attempted repeatedly to portray her as a vengeful woman, weaponizing her position, pressing her again and again on why she had never revealed her judicial title the moment officers approached her. Celine answered that the right to be free from an unjustified search did not belong exclusively to judges and that she had simply asked for the legal basis of the stop and stated her refusal to consent exactly as any ordinary citizen was entitled to do. Hale accused her of deliberately baiting Harlan into overstepping his authority so she could later use it against him. Celine calmly recounted the timeline of that night down to the exact minute, recalling the position of every officer present, Harlan's precise words, and the moment Maxwell had disappeared from the balcony above the lobby. Her composure unsettled Hale far more than any outburst would have, and the courtroom listened in complete stillness as she spoke. Hale tried a different approach, suggesting that a woman with her legal training would have known precisely how to provoke an officer into making a mistake he could later be punished for, framing her calm responses as calculated theater rather than instinct. Celine reminded him that she had spent that entire evening with no idea she would ever need to defend herself in a courtroom, since she had believed right up until the case was forced open that the encounter would end quietly, the way so many similar encounters never did for people without her title. She told him that the calm he found so suspicious was not a legal strategy, but a survival habit, one she had practiced since childhood, long before she had ever opened a law book, because raising her voice in moments like that one had never once made her safer. A few jurors shifted in their seats, and even Judge Thorne allowed a long pause before instructing Hale to move to his next line of questioning. Hale then pivoted to Celine's silence in the days following the incident, suggesting that a truly aggrieved victim would have spoken publicly right away rather than waiting for a formal hearing to share her account. Celine explained that she had been advised to protect the integrity of the judicial process and that she had honored that advice despite watching a distorted version of events spread unchallenged across local television for nearly a week. She added that her silence had never been confusion about what happened to her, only patience about when the full truth would finally be allowed to speak for itself. The remark drew a visible reaction from several spectators in the gallery, and Hale returned to his table without asking another question. The full, unedited body camera footage was played for the courtroom, and everyone present heard Harlan describe Celine as the kind of person who always had something to hide. Hale argued weakly that the remark reflected nothing more than unprofessional language rather than evidence of any coordinated plan. Tessa then presented the dispatch log showing that the so-called anonymous tip had been entered only after Celine had already been stopped, generated from a terminal inside Chief Crow's own office. Crow denied ever touching the terminal himself, insisting his account credentials must have been compromised by someone else entirely. Just as the hearing seemed to stall beneath a wall of denials, Elise Marin walked into the courtroom, still in uniform, though she no longer wore the insignia of Harlan's unit. She confirmed under oath that Harlan had received a photograph of the target's bag before he ever set foot inside the hotel that night. The sender of that photograph was not Chief Crow at all. It was Maxwell Ashford's own personal cell phone number, and the revelation sent a visible ripple of shock through the entire gallery. Maxwell admitted to sending the photograph, but claimed he had simply been alerting police to a suspicious individual he believed was smuggling narcotics into the hotel. Corbin Hale introduced an anonymous message suggesting drugs would be hidden inside a black leather case, presenting it as reasonable justification for his client's actions. Tessa asked the obvious question hanging over the entire courtroom. How could an anonymous source describe the exact case with such precision while somehow never once describing the face of the person carrying it? Investigators soon discovered that the photograph of the case itself had been taken from inside the federal courthouse's own security office days earlier, proving that someone within the system had leaked Celine's schedule before she ever arrived in Havenport. That leak traced back to Fletcher Kane, a coordinator for a private security firm contracted to the federal courthouse, who had passed along the scheduled hotel information and a description of the luggage directly to Maxwell. The firm employing Fletcher turned out to be a subsidiary quietly owned by Ashford Urban Holdings itself. Fletcher had never actually known that the traveler was a sitting federal judge, since the internal record had listed her only under the initials A. Voss rather than her full title. Maxwell had genuinely believed the case belonged to Mira Langley, the auditor preparing to hand financial records over to federal investigators that very same night. His plan had been almost elegantly simple. Invent a narcotics tip, allow officers to seize the case in the confusion, and quietly ensure it disappeared from the evidence room before anyone examined its contents too closely. Mira had changed her plans at the last possible moment, and Celine happened to be carrying a nearly identical case containing nothing more than a federal preservation order. That single coincidence had unraveled the entire conspiracy in front of dozens of witnesses. Crow continued insisting he had known nothing about Maxwell's true intentions, claiming he had merely responded to a legitimate public safety concern about narcotics inside the hotel. Investigators later reconstructed the full shape of the scheme by tracing years of property transactions across the neighborhoods bordering downtown Havenport, and the pattern that emerged was almost mechanical in its precision. A corner grocery would suddenly face a wave of health code citations. Then a laundromat 2 blocks away would be cited for zoning violations that had never been enforced before. And within a matter of weeks, a small notice would appear announcing a change in ownership. Ashford Urban Holdings rarely appeared as the buyer directly, instead routing purchases through a rotating set of shell companies with names that sounded like they belonged to family trusts, rather than a billionaire's acquisition machine. Mira had spent nearly a year quietly cross-referencing permit records, foundation donation logs, and police overtime sheets before she finally noticed that every spike in aggressive patrol activity landed within days of a clean corridor payment clearing the city's books. She had almost given up twice, worried that the pattern was simply coincidence dressed up as conspiracy, the kind of thing that looked damning on paper but fell apart the moment a defense attorney demanded hard proof. What kept her going was a conversation with a shop owner named Amos Carver, who had lost his barbershop of many years after officers searched his storage room 3 separate times without ever finding anything. Each search conducted only days before a buyer's offer arrived on his desk. Amos had signed the papers exhausted and afraid, certain the searches would continue until he had nothing left to lose. And his story convinced Mira that the numbers on her spreadsheets represented real people rather than abstract statistics. It was that conviction that had pushed her to risk her position and reach out to Tessa Harlow in the first place. Tessa then produced a text message recovered directly from Harlan's phone, sent from Crow's number the same night, instructing him not to worry about the contents of the case and simply bring it back before midnight. Crow continued, attempting to explain the message away as something taken entirely out of context. At that exact moment, Harlan requested a private conversation with the federal prosecutor handling the case, no longer willing to absorb the full weight of the scandal alone. In exchange for a chance at reduced consequences, Harlan agreed to describe the full operation in detail. He confirmed that Crow routinely received lists of target addresses directly from Ashford's office. addresses that his unit would then flood with traffic stops, license inspections, and mounting pressure across neighborhoods Maxwell wanted to acquire. Most officers in the unit had no idea of the true purpose behind these operations, believing instead that they were participating in a legitimate crime reduction initiative. Harlan understood far more than most, since he personally received performance bonuses funneled through the Havenport Police Foundation for every successful operation completed. On the night at the hotel, Crow had ordered him to seize the case using whatever justification could later be defended on paper, with the narcotics tip fabricated afterward simply to make the seizure appear legitimate. Maxwell denied every allegation and insisted that Harlan was lying purely to save himself from prosecution. Corbin Hale attacked the credibility of testimony coming from a man actively negotiating a deal with prosecutors, hoping to plant enough doubt to protect his client. Tessa was careful not to rest the case on Harlan's word alone, presenting instead the financial records Mira Langley had painstakingly compiled over months of quiet auditing. Every surge in Ashford's donations aligned precisely with the timing of aggressive search campaigns across the city, and each campaign was reliably followed within weeks by another land acquisition credited to Ashford Urban Holdings. Marisol Vega returned to the stand as well, admitting under oath that Maxwell had personally pressured her to disable the lobby cameras, threatening to terminate the hotel's management contract if she refused to comply. The final piece of evidence came from an internal audio system inside the ballroom itself, where a microphone near the speaking podium had remained active the entire evening. It had captured Maxwell speaking directly to Crow, telling him to retrieve the case before the judge ever laid eyes on what was inside it. He had no idea in that moment that the woman holding the case already was the judge, and that his own words were being preserved by the very system he believed he controlled. After hearing the full body of evidence, Judge Elias Thorne ordered the Havenport Police Department placed under independent federal oversight effective immediately. Chief Crow was suspended from duty and his case referred directly to a grand jury, while Maxwell Ashford faced formal investigation for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to tamper with federal evidence, and bribery of public officials. Harlan was stripped of his duties pending trial, and Elise Marin received formal protection under the department's whistleblower provisions in recognition of the risk she had taken. Before closing the hearing, Thorne invited Celine to address the courtroom on the broader question of judicial ethics raised by the case. Many in the room expected her to condemn the men who had humiliated her in front of a crowded lobby only weeks earlier. Instead, Celine set the scratch black case down on the evidence table and explained that when Harlan believed she was simply an ordinary black woman, he decided she deserved no explanation, no patience, and no basic respect at all. Only the sight of a golden seal had made him afraid of the consequences that might follow. Celine told the courtroom that this fear, not her title, was the detail that troubled her most deeply. The law had already protected her rights long before that case was ever opened, and her position had not created that protection. It had only forced men who violated it to suddenly realize they had chosen the wrong target. She reminded the room that Amos Carver had asked the very same question she had asked that night, had stated his own refusal just as clearly, and had still lost many years of his life's work because no golden seal had ever appeared to interrupt what was happening to him. She turned briefly toward Harlan, who sat with his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, and told him she did not need an apology addressed to her personally, because the apology that mattered belonged to every person his unit had searched before she ever walked into that lobby. She said that real accountability would not be measured by what happened to her case alone, but by whether the department was willing to examine every file that looked exactly like it, even the ones that had never made the evening news. Several people in the gallery nodded slowly, and Tessa made a note to ensure the reopened case review would include every incident report filed under Harlan's unit across the preceding years, not merely the one connected to a judge. She closed with a single sentence that settled over the courtroom like a verdict of its own, saying that a justice system which only functions when the victim happens to hold power is not justice at all, but merely fear wearing a uniform. No one in the gallery spoke for a long moment afterward, and even Judge Thorne allowed the silence to stretch before calling the session to a close. The golden seal had not been what saved Celine that night. It had simply forced an entire corrupt system to expose itself inside the very courthouse it had once believed it could outmaneuver. In the months that followed, the Clean Corridor program was permanently shut down, and every questionable search connected to it was reopened for independent review. Business owners who had been pressured out of their properties were granted the right to seek compensation, and every pending contract between the city and Ashford Urban Holdings was frozen indefinitely. Elise Marin became a central witness in the broader reform of the police department, and though she was never treated as a hero in any public sense, her decision to keep her camera running had protected the truth when almost everyone around her chose silence instead. Marisol Vega lost her position at the Halcyon Crown for refusing to continue covering for Maxwell, and she later partnered with investigators to help design stronger data preservation protocols for hotels across the region. Celine declined every major interview request that followed the trial, unwilling to let her story become a legend about a powerful judge who frightened corrupt officers into submission. To her, the real concern remained the countless people who had been searched and humiliated in exactly the same way without ever having a golden seal hidden inside their bag to save them. Amos Carver, the barbershop owner whose story had first convinced Mira Langley to keep digging, was among the first to receive a settlement under the new compensation program, though no amount of money could fully restore the many years he had spent building something of his own. He used part of the payment to open a smaller shop 2 streets over, and he kept a framed newspaper clipping about the trial on the wall beside the mirror, not out of pride in the attention it brought him, but as a quiet reminder to his customers that persistence sometimes did get rewarded, even when it took far longer than it should have. Elise Marin visited the new shop once, off duty and out of uniform, and the two of them talked for a long while about how easily the whole pattern could have continued unnoticed if a handful of people had simply chosen silence instead. Judge Elias Thorne continued overseeing the federal monitorship of the Havenport Police Department for the following years, requiring quarterly public reporting on stop and search data broken down by neighborhood. The numbers, once made visible, told a story that no press conference or foundation gala had ever been willing to tell honestly, and community meetings that had once drawn a handful of skeptical residents began filling entire auditoriums. Reform did not arrive as a single triumphant moment, but as a slow accumulation of small corrections, new training requirements, an independent complaint review board, and a citizen oversight panel with actual subpoena power. Each one built on evidence the trial had forced into daylight. Maxwell Ashford's company faced years of civil litigation from former property owners seeking to reclaim what had been taken from them through coercion rather than fair negotiation. And though not every case succeeded, the mere existence of so many filed together changed how developers across the state approached similar projects afterward. Harlan eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges in exchange for his cooperation, and Crow's case moved toward trial with far less sympathy from the public than he had once commanded during his years of celebrated leadership. None of it undid what had already happened to the people caught in the years before Celine ever checked into the Halcyon Crown. But it closed the door on the years that might have followed if the case in her hands had never been opened. Before she finally left Havenport, Celine walked back through the same lobby where everything had begun. Staff members straightened instinctively at the sight of her, addressing her respectfully as Your Honor and reaching to carry her luggage as she passed. Celine gently declined their help just as she always had. Inside her bag sat the same black leather case, its clasp long since repaired, though she had specifically asked that the scratch across the golden seal remain exactly as it was. The mark reminded her that power knows an entire room in an instant, but only the truth could force a whole corrupt system to finally answer for what it had done. She paused for a moment beside the same marble table where her belongings had once been scattered in front of strangers, and she found she felt no bitterness standing there, only a quiet certainty that the truth had eventually done what it was supposed to do, even if it had taken far too long and cost far too many people far too much along the way. The story closed as Celine stepped through the hotel doors the same way she had walked in, without an escort, without applause, and without needing anyone to know her title before they chose to treat her like a human being.